You are listening to PR Radio Station of America.
The first day of the General Assembly in New York began with the usual pomp and ceremony. Motorcades snaking through Manhattan, security barricades lining the streets, and reporters swarming outside hotels. Yet for Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, this was no ordinary gathering. His aides described the week as a fight for survival in the court of global opinion. In his hotel suite overlooking the East River, Zelenskyy held a final briefing with his closest advisors. They spread maps, satellite images, and casualty statistics across the table, determined to arm him with every argument that could pierce the indifference of tired allies. While other leaders rehearsed polished speeches filled with vague promises, Zelenskyy prepared a personal appeal. He had written and rewritten his remarks, scratching out phrases and adding notes in the margins. The goal was simple but daunting: to remind the world that his nation was still under daily bombardment, that his people lived under the constant sound of sirens, and that the war was not a distant conflict but a present danger to the entire European continent. He repeated the phrase "robust action" to his aides like a mantra, insisting that without genuine strength, peace would remain an illusion. Trump's role in this drama hovered in the background like a shadow. After his meeting with Vladimir Putin in Alaska, speculation ran wild about his intentions. Was he growing weary of negotiations? Was he ready to push for harsher sanctions, or instead lean toward compromise? Zelenskyy instructed his staff to prepare two separate strategies for his conversation with Trump, one if Trump came in supportive, and another if he came in skeptical. The Ukrainian leader knew that his own credibility, and perhaps the fate of future sanctions, could depend on a single private exchange. As Zelenskyy rehearsed, the news cycle churned. Reports from Kyiv detailed fresh Russian strikes on civilian areas, including a hospital and several apartment blocks. His advisors debated whether to show graphic photos of injured children on the assembly floor. Some argued the images were too disturbing. Others said only such raw evidence could shake world leaders from complacency. In the end, Zelenskyy decided to carry the photographs with him, tucked into a folder, ready to hold up as proof of his nation's suffering if words alone failed. When Zelenskyy finally stepped into the motorcade bound for the assembly, New York traffic halted to make way. Crowds waved Ukrainian flags outside the barricades, chanting his name, while across the street a smaller group of protesters shouted slogans against further involvement in the war. The split in public opinion mirrored the divisions he would face inside the marble halls of diplomacy. As he gazed out the tinted window at the skyline, he whispered three words to himself, the same ones he had circled in red ink in his notes: strength, unity, resolve. The battle for the week had only just begun. While Zelenskyy prepared for speeches and private meetings in New York, the situation in Eastern Europe was heating up. On September 9th, Russian drones crossed into Polish airspace. The alarms triggered instantly, and Polish pilots scrambled their jets alongside Allied warplanes. Within minutes, the drones were shot down, but the message was clear: Russia was testing the edges of NATO territory. In Warsaw, citizens woke to headlines screaming about incursions, and politicians convened emergency sessions, warning that what was once considered unlikely now felt dangerously possible. 10 days later, Estonia reported that Russian fighter jets had violated its airspace. The incident sent shockwaves through the Baltics. For small nations with fragile borders, every violation carried the weight of history. Estonian officials insisted they had irrefutable radar data proving the breach. Television anchors replayed maps and graphics late into the night, showing the path of the jets. At the same time, Moscow flatly denied everything, with its spokesman dismissing the claims as propaganda. The denial only inflamed anger, as Estonian leaders accused Russia not only of dangerous provocations, but also of lying openly to the entire world. Latvia's president joined the chorus, declaring that Russia was deliberately probing NATO defenses to measure political will. His post on social media gained traction across Europe, sparking heated debates about whether the alliance was doing enough to deter aggression. Citizens in Latvia and Lithuania expressed fears that they could be next, with some families stocking supplies or discussing evacuation plans. Suddenly, the idea of war spilling over no longer seemed like a distant nightmare, but a realistic scenario that leaders had to address. In New York, Zelensky's aides seized on these developments. They adjusted his speeches to highlight the provocations, framing them as proof that Russia's war could not be contained within Ukraine. They argued that the safety of Warsaw, Tallinn, and Riga was inseparable from the defense of Kiev. The talking points were sharpened to remind allies that hesitation today could mean chaos tomorrow. Every incursion was treated as a warning sign, every denial from Moscow as evidence of a broader strategy of deception. Behind the scenes, European diplomats arrived at the assembly furious and anxious. Conversations in hallways buzzed with phrases like border violations and escalation risks. For Zelenskyy, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. The provocations gave urgency to his calls for robust action, but they also raised the stakes. If NATO appeared weak, Russia would only push harder. As he reviewed the final drafts of his remarks, Zelenskyy understood that his task was no longer only about aid for Ukraine, but about defending the credibility of the alliance itself. Away from the cameras and bright lights of the assembly hall, the real negotiations began. In a quiet conference room, Zelenskyy spread out folders across a long oak table. Each folder contained photos of bombed schools, shattered hospitals, and testimonies from survivors. He looked directly at the leaders seated around him and asked a question that left the room silent. If this were your children under the rubble, how much longer would you wait? His words carried the urgency of a man whose nation was still under attack every single day. Trump entered one of the side meetings flanked by advisors. His expression was guarded, his tone measured. He had once believed a ceasefire might be easier to reach, but in recent weeks, his frustration with Moscow had grown. In Alaska, he had hoped for a breakthrough with Putin, but instead, he returned with the sense that Russia was simply stalling. Zelenskyy knew this was his chance. If he could channel Trump's disappointment into stronger support for sanctions and aid, he might leave New York with momentum on his side. European leaders listened carefully, but their hesitation was obvious. The prime ministers of smaller nations spoke passionately about solidarity, while representatives of larger economies worried aloud about energy markets and inflation. Voters at home were restless, weary of sending money and weapons abroad while facing rising prices. Zelenskyy countered sharply, reminding them that the cost of inaction would be far greater. If Russia succeeds here, none of you are safe tomorrow, he warned, sliding forward a report showing Russian provocations near NATO borders. The discussions grew tense. Some leaders pressed for more details about how Ukraine would use additional military aid, while others questioned whether sanctions were truly weakening Russia. Zelenskyy's aides presented charts showing how Russian oil revenue had dipped after earlier restrictions, but also how loopholes allowed Moscow to keep funding its war machine. The message was clear: sanctions needed to be tougher, broader, and better enforced. He urged them to cut off energy imports completely, echoing Trump's earlier public statements. By the end of the meeting, there was no grand agreement, but Zelenskyy had made his point. He walked out of the room with promises of consideration and further review, the kind of diplomatic language that sounded vague in public but hinted at progress behind the scenes. In the hallway, reporters shouted questions, but Zelenskyy gave only a brief smile. His team knew that while speeches could inspire, it was these closed-door confrontations that would determine whether sanctions would grow sharper and support stronger. The battle for unity was still unfolding. The Great Assembly Hall was buzzing with anticipation as Zelenskyy prepared to step onto the marble podium. Delegates adjusted earpieces for translation, journalists leaned forward in the press gallery, and television cameras zoomed in. When his name was called, the room fell into a tense quiet. Zelenskyy walked to the podium carrying a slim folder, his posture straight, his expression calm but fierce. He began not with lofty language, but with stark facts. The number of children killed in recent airstrikes, the number of homes destroyed, the number of civilians displaced. The silence in the hall deepened as the reality sank in. Then came the visual moment. Zelenskyy held up a piece of jagged metal, shrapnel collected from the courtyard of a Kiev school just weeks earlier. The hall gasped. He described how the missile exploded near a playground, scattering debris across the pavement where children had been playing minutes before. "This is not just about Ukraine," he said, his voice rising. "This is about the safety of every child who should never have to fear a sky filled with fire." For a moment, Even the most skeptical delegates were transfixed. Outside the assembly building, the atmosphere was no less intense. Thousands of demonstrators lined the streets. Ukrainian expatriates waved blue and yellow flags, chanting for action, while counter-protesters accused Western governments of fueling the conflict. Police formed barricades as the chants of both sides echoed through the streets of New York. Journalists reported live from the sidewalks, emphasizing how the protests mirrored the divisions inside the hall: support, fatigue, hope, and doubt colliding all at once. Back inside, delegates from NATO countries huddled in whispered conversations. Should they commit to stronger sanctions? Should they risk further confrontation with Moscow? Some argued that cutting off Russian oil entirely was the only way to cripple its war machine. Others feared the economic backlash at home. A few representatives even floated the possibility of setting clearer red lines if Russian provocations at NATO borders continued. Zelensky's words had sharpened the urgency of these debates, pushing leaders to think beyond cautious statements. By the end of the day, progress emerged. Several European leaders issued a joint declaration condemning the airspace violations in Poland and Estonia, pledging to increase sanctions and provide additional support to Ukraine. It was not everything Zelensky had asked for, but it was a visible step forward. As he left the hall, cameras captured him shaking hands with allies, his expression showing relief mixed with determination. The turning point had come. Ukraine had gained momentum, but the battle for unity was far from over. As the final sessions of the General Assembly closed, exhaustion showed on the faces of delegates and staffers. The week had been packed with tense speeches, back-to-back negotiations, and long nights of drafting communiques. Zelensky returned to his hotel with his team, reviewing the commitments that had been secured. He knew they were modest compared to what he had asked for, but they were also more than he had when he arrived. Sanctions were set to expand. NATO leaders had condemned the latest Russian provocations, and the debate about energy dependency was shifting in Ukraine's favor. Meanwhile, Moscow's response was sharp and mocking. Russian spokespersons dismissed the assembly as theater, accusing NATO nations of hysteria and painting Zelensky as a desperate performer. Yet analysts noted a different tone beneath the bluster. Russia's concern was real. The unity shown in New York, however fragile, suggested that Western leaders were not ready to let Ukraine stand alone. Kremlin-controlled media focused on portraying the week as a failure for Zelensky, but the very intensity of their coverage revealed unease. Across Europe, the fallout was immediate. Poland and the Baltic states announced heightened air patrols, deploying additional fighter jets to their borders. Military exercises were expanded, and ordinary citizens braced for what might come next. In Latvia and Estonia, shops reported surges in demand for emergency supplies. NATO headquarters issued a statement confirming that its members were prepared to defend every inch of alliance territory. The sense of unease mixed with determination spread across capitals, reinforcing Zelensky's message. The war was no longer just Ukraine's problem. For Zelensky personally, the week was both a victory and a reminder of the long road ahead. On his social media platform, he wrote a reflection that quickly went viral. Without strength, peace will not prevail. His supporters praised his relentless energy, while critics argued he was demanding too much from allies already under pressure. Yet one thing was undeniable. His presence in New York had forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths about the cost of inaction. As his plane departed from New York back toward Kyiv, Zelensky gazed out the window at the fading city lights. He had secured promises, sparked debates, and strengthened alliances, but the bombs would still be falling when he landed. The week had shown progress, but also how fragile global unity remained. For the people of Ukraine, for the nervous citizens of Poland and the Baltics, and for the broader world, the story was not over. It was only the beginning of another uncertain chapter in a war that continued to test the strength, unity, and resolve of nations. This is the end of that story. Now tell me in the comments, what's your story? I'll read out the most interesting ones in the next video. Do not forget to hit a like button and subscribe. See you.